Thank God. This incredible HFY masterpiece found you today. Witness the legend starting now. The Galactic Cooperative had spent approximately 7,000 years perfecting their species classification system, which was really just a fancy way of saying they had finally agreed on how to rank every sentient being in the known universe by how easily they could be killed. It was not the music's most diplomatic framework, admittedly, but after the incident of the crystalline delegation, where a particularly enthusiastic handshake had literally shattered Ambassador Quelix into 17 pieces, practicality had won over politeness. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Class 1 species, hailed from garden worlds where evolution had been less of a brutal, gladiatorial arena and more of a gentle suggestion. These beings required music-specific atmospheric compositions, precise temperature ranges, and absolutely no sudden movements. Music Class 2 species were marginally hardier, capable of surviving minor fluctuations in their environment without immediately expiring. The classifications continued upward, music under each tier representing species who had evolved in progressively more hostile conditions. Then there were the Death Worlders, Class 9 and Class 10 music. Species came from planets that seemed to actively hate life, where survival was less of a given and more of a daily miracle. These worlds featured extreme gravity, violent weather patterns, aggressive megafauna, and ecosystems that operated music on the principle that everything wanted to kill everything else. Naturally, the Galactic Cooperative music kept a very careful distance from Death Worlders, who were regarded with the same mixture of awe and terror that one might reserve for an active volcano wearing a smile. Earth had been classified as a Class 10 music. Death World within approximately 47 minutes of first contact. The human delegation had seemed confused, music by this designation, which should have been the first warning sign. Any species that did not immediately, music understand why their homeworld was considered a cosmic horror show was clearly suffering music from severe psychological damage. The humans had politely inquired about the classification criteria, listened to the exhaustive list of their planet's nightmarish qualities, and then responded with something that roughly translated to, yeah, I guess it does rain a lot. This response had required 3 weeks of xenopsychological counseling for the evaluation committee. Despite Earth's terrifying classification, humans had been provisionally accepted into the Galactic Cooperative, with one critical stipulation: limited interaction with Class 1 through Class 5 music species until proper safety protocols could be established. It was the diplomatic equivalent of saying, yes, you can join our club, but please stay in that corner and try not to breathe too loudly, which made the Galactic Music Youth Exchange program's decision to accept a human student at Veltron Academy either remarkably progressive or catastrophically music stupid, depending on who you asked. Veltron Academy occupied a massive station in neutral space, a gleaming construct of silver and crystalline architecture that housed music, approximately 12,000 students from 73 different species. It was considered music the pinnacle of civilized education, where the galaxy's brightest young minds gathered to learn music, advanced sciences, cultural diplomacy, and the art of not accidentally killing each other music. Through biological incompatibility, the station maintained a carefully controlled environment, calibrated for Class 1 through Class 4 species. The atmosphere was a precise mixture of gases, the temperature held at a comfortable 20°C standard, and the gravity maintained at a gentle 0.7 music. Standard G, everything was soft edges, music, and muted colors, designed for species whose evolutionary history had not included concepts like music, predation, or survival of the fittest. Into this delicate ecosystem, they had invited a human. The girl arrived on a Tuesday, which would later be remembered as either cosmically ironic or prophetically appropriate. She came through the docking bay with minimal luggage, wearing what the music intake coordinator's database identified as a school uniform from her home world: a dark blazer, a pleated skirt, knee-high socks, and a small backpack decorated with colorful pins. She looked, by all available evidence, utterly harmless. This was the galaxy's first mistake. Music intake coordinator Jellisk, a centauran whose species resembled what humans might describe as a floating jellyfish. made of lavender smoke, processed the human's arrival with professional efficiency tinged with barely concealed nervousness. The human had smiled during the intake process, which had exposed her teeth, bone-white calcium structures designed for tearing and grinding. Angelisk had required a moment to compose himself. "Welcome to Valterin Academy," Jelisk had said, his vocoder translating his chemical emissions into comprehensible language. "Your species designation has been noted, and we have prepared music-appropriate accommodations. Please be aware that your physical capabilities may exceed those of your fellow students, and we ask that you exercise appropriate restraint." The human had nodded with what appeared to be genuine understanding, which was somehow more unsettling than if she music had argued. "Of course," she had said. "I will be super careful. I promise." The use of the word super had not been reassuring. The girl had been assigned to Residential Wing 7, a section populated primarily music, by Class 2 and Class 3, species who were deemed sturdy enough to handle proximity to someone from a more robust music evolutionary background. Her roommate was a planarian named Music Vixery, whose species resembled a collection of floating geometric shapes held together by some force that physics could not adequately explain. Vixery had prepared extensively for the human's arrival, reading every available music file on Earth and its inhabitants. She considered herself intellectually ready for the experience. She was, it would turn out, catastrophically wrong. The first incident occurred music within 6 hours. Vixery had watched with increasing concern as the human unpacked her belongings, music which included several items that appeared designed for survival scenarios that should never occur in civilized space. A compressed sleeping bag rated for 40 degree, a multi-tool that included no fewer than 17 different blades, a container of something labeled emergency rations that, according to the translator, could sustain a human for up to 5 music days in hostile territory. "Do you expect hostile territory at an educational institution?" Vixery had asked, her geometric components rearranging themselves into a pattern that indicated polite confusion. The human had laughed, which was a sound that Vixery's species found deeply unsettling on a biological level. "Oh no, these are just normal things I brought from home. You know, just in case." "Just in case of what specifically?" "I don't know. Anything, I guess." This answer had music not provided the comfort Vixery was seeking. The human had then proceeded to perform what she called her evening routine, which involved a series of physical exercises music that defied Vixery's understanding of biology. The girl dropped to the floor, or music, and executed 30 repetitions of an exercise called push-ups, which required her to lift her entire music body weight using only her arms. She followed this with something called sit-ups and music and then squats, then a stretching routine that suggested her skeletal structure was held together by rubber instead of proper bone. "Is this necessary for your health?" Vixery had asked, watching with a mixture music of horror and fascination. "Not really," the human had replied, slightly out of breath. "I just like to stay music in shape. Plus, I am on the track team back home, so I need to keep up my training." The concept of voluntarily engaging in music, physical exertion beyond what was strictly necessary for survival, was so alien to Vixery that she required several minutes to process it. The human had then consumed approximately 1 L of water in a single continuous gulp, smiled music brightly, and announced she was going to take a shower with the water temperature set to as hot as possible. Vixery had immediately filed a wellness check with the residential advisor. By the end of the first week, the human had become something of a legend among the student body, though not in the way the exchange program coordinators had hoped. Stories circulated through the residential wings, each more alarming than the last, and all of them completely true. In Professor Kelman's introduction to organic chemistry music class, the human had accidentally knocked over a beaker containing a solution of diluted hydrochloric acid. While the other students had evacuated in accordance with safety protocols, the human had simply grabbed the nearest absorption cloth and cleaned up the spill with her bare hands. When Professor Kelman, music, a gaseous being who existed primarily as a sentient cloud, had frantically informed her that the acid could cause severe burns, the human had examined her hands with mild curiosity. "Oh yeah, my skin is a little red," she had observed. I should probably wash this music off, huh? The concentration that would have permanently scarred most Class 1 through class music. 4 species had caused her minor dermatological irritation. Professor Kelman had canceled the rest of that day's classes to reevaluate music. His career choices. Physical education had been similarly catastrophic. The class was designed music for species whose idea of exercise involved gentle floating or perhaps some light hovering. The human had arrived in specialized clothing called athletic wear and had proceeded music to treat the low-gravity gymnasium like her personal training facility. When the instructor, a Delphinian named Chorus, had suggested they music begin with a light warm-up jog, the human had nodded agreeably and started running, except her version of running involved moving at speeds that most species reserved for emergency evacuations. She had circled the gymnasium 17 times in the span of 3 minutes, her feet striking the padded floor with rhythmic impacts that sounded like a percussion instrument designed to intimidate prey. Chorus had watched with increasing alarm as the human's music body did things that should not be possible for any oxygen-breathing organism. Her skin had changed music color, shifting to a flushed pink as her internal temperature regulation system activated. She had begun secreting liquid through her skin, a waste elimination system that operated continuously during physical exertion. Her respiratory rate had increased, pulling in huge volumes of the station's carefully calibrated atmosphere. And she had music smiled the entire time as if this was enjoyable. Is the pace too slow? She had asked when she finally stopped. Our music crying barely wended. I can go faster if you want. Chorus had needed music to sit down, which was particularly notable given that his species did not technically have the ability to sit. The cafeteria incident had become the stuff of station-wide legend. The human's dietary requirements were, to put it mildly, disturbing. She was an omnivore, which meant she could consume both plant and music animal matter, already a red flag for species who had evolved past such barbaric practices. But the specifics of what she ate had caused several students to question the fundamental fairness of evolution. On her 3rd day, she had casually mentioned that her music favorite food was something called pizza, which apparently involved taking grain products, music coating them with liquefied dairy proteins, adding processed plant matter, and then, this was the part music that had caused residential advisor Flum to require medical attention, topping the entire music, construction with preserved meat from an earth creature called a pig. You consume the flesh of other organisms? A crystalline student had asked about music, her prismatic structure flickering with distress. Well, yeah, the human had replied, apparently confused by the question. Humans are apex predators. We eat pretty much everything. Music. The phrase apex predator had entered the station's rumor mill with the force of a small explosive device. But it was the human's music, casual relationship with danger, that truly set her apart from her fellow music students. Things that would send Class 1 species into panic attacks barely. Registered on her threat assessment music scale. When a minor power fluctuation had caused the lights in Corridor 9 to flicker, the human had simply pulled out a small cylindrical device from her pocket that produced its own light. She had called it a flashlight and explained that she always carried one just in case. The concept of being prepared for infrastructure failure as a matter of routine had been genuinely incomprehensible to species whose stations had not music experienced a power failure in 600 years. When a fellow student had discovered what he believed was a dangerous creature in the common area, later identified as a completely harmless cleaning drone that had malfunctioned, the human had calmly approached it, diagnosed the problem, and fixed it using her multi-tool. She had then picked up the drone, music which weighed approximately 15 kilos, with one hand and returned it to the maintenance closet. It just needed a reboot, music, she had explained to the dozen students who had evacuated to a safe music distance. No big deal. The casual application of problem-solving music, skills and physical capability had been extremely big deal. By the 2nd week, the human had acquired an entourage of students who followed her around with the dedication of religious pilgrims, though their motivations ranged from scientific curiosity to the kind of morbid fascination music One might have watching a natural disaster unfold in slow motion. They cataloged her behaviors, recorded her statements, and tried music desperately to understand the psychology of a species that had evolved to find their nightmare homeworld perfectly acceptable. Professor Threnody, who taught comparative xenobiology, had made the human the subject of an entire lecture series. With the girl's permission, he had conducted a comprehensive biological scan, and the results had required him to update approximately music 40% of his course materials. The human skeletal structure was reinforced with a mineral compound that made it approximately 3 times denser than music, comparable Class 1 species. Her muscular system operated on a ratio of strength to mass that seemed to violate several principles. Music of evolutionary efficiency. Her cardiovascular system could increase its performance by music, up to 300% during stress responses, flooding her tissues music, with oxygenated blood and triggering a cascade of chemical reactions that music temporarily enhanced her physical capabilities even further. Her immune system was a military-industrial complex operating inside her body, capable of identifying, targeting, and destroying thousands of different pathogens. She possessed redundant organs, a distributed nervous system that could continue functioning even music if parts of it were damaged, and a pain tolerance that Professor Threnody described as clinically concerning. Your species evolved to survive. Everything, Professor Threnody had said during one of their conversations, music, his chitinous exterior clicking with agitation. Your bodies are designed for a world that is actively trying to kill you at all times. The human. Music had considered this for a moment, then shrugged. I mean, Earth is not that bad. Sure, we have hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, droughts, music floods, wildfires, and like a bunch of animals that can kill you, but you learn to deal with it. It is just home, you know? Professor Threnody had not known, and had spent the rest music of the day questioning his understanding of the word home. The turning point came during the 3rd week, when Station Director Valerix called in music emergency assembly to discuss a developing situation. A solar flare from the nearby star was going to impact the station's shields, potentially causing fluctuations in the environmental systems. It was a minor issue, the sort of thing that happened once every few years, and the station systems were designed to compensate automatically. There may be some temporary variations in temperature, music, and atmospheric composition, Director Valerix announced, her scaled crest flattening with concern. We recommend all students remain in their quarters until the event passes. It should last no more than 6 hours. The student body music had received this news with appropriate levels of anxiety. Temperature variations could be dangerous for species with narrow environmental tolerances. Atmospheric changes could cause music respiratory distress. 6 hours was a long time to endure potentially music uncomfortable conditions. The human had raised her hand, yes. Director Valerix had music said, recognizing her with some trepidation. What is the expected temperature range? Director Valerix consulted her datapad. We anticipate fluctuations between 18 and 28 degrees standard. Additionally, oxygen levels may vary between 19 and 23%, and humidity could increase by up to 15%. The human had nodded thoughtfully. Okay, so basically a normal spring day on Earth, got it. The assembly hall music had gone completely silent. I am sorry, Director Valerix had said carefully. Did you say a normal spring day? Yeah, those are pretty standard conditions where I am from. Actually, it is a lot more stable than most days back music home. At least you know what is coming and can prepare for it. The implication that Earth's normal music unpredictable weather was worse than what the station considered an emergency had required music. Several minutes of stunned silence to process. When the solar flare hit, the station system's music performed exactly as predicted. The temperature climbed to 27 in some sections. Music dropped to 18 in others. The atmospheric processors struggled to maintain consistent oxygen levels. Humidity spiked, causing condensation on some of the cooler music surfaces. For most of the student body, it was a miserable 6 hours spent in music their quarters, managing mild discomfort and complaining to each other through the station's communication network. The human had gone for a jog. Vixery had watched in disbelief as her roommate laced music up her running shoes, a concept that still baffled her, as most species did not require specialized equipment for the basic music, active locomotion, and announced she was going to take advantage of the humidity to get some good cardio in. The environmental conditions are outside safe parameters. Music Vixery had protested weakly. For you, maybe. The human had replied music cheerfully. For me, this is great training weather. Back home, I used to run in way worse conditions. One time I did a 5-kilometer race in the rain when it was like 12 degrees. Music, this is basically perfect. She had left the room at music a light jog, her footfalls echoing down the corridor with metronomic precision. Within 20 minutes, reports had started flooding into the station's emergency response network. A human student was running through,